In the United States, and Donald Trump has announced he is going to double the tariffs imposed on Canadian steel and aluminium.
In the United States, and Donald Trump has announced he is going to double the tariffs imposed on Canadian steel and aluminium. With Canada facing down American tariffs of 25% on aluminum and steel, industry leaders are sounding the alarm stressing just how much economic hurt this decision. Steel and aluminum were the first tremors. On June 1, 2018, the United States ended Canada's temporary exemption and slapped national security tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, abruptly turning two of the most integrated cross-border supply chains in the world into contested territory. The move, taken under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, arrived like a jolt in Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie, where steel is a local identity as much as an industry, and in Quebec's Saguenay, Alma, Arvida, Jonquière, where smelters light the night sky. It also landed squarely in the middle of NAFTA renegotiations, setting a punchy tone for everything that followed. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Canada answered with speed and precision. After consultations and an outpouring of submissions from businesses and unions, Ottawa retaliated dollar for dollar, imposing surtaxes on up to $16.6 billion of U.S. imports starting July 1, SB 2018. Thesk, ketchup, yogurt, whiskey, powerboats, dish soap, designed to sting where congressional pressure might mount. At the same time, the federal government unveiled up to $16.6 billion of U.S. imports starting July 1, 2018. Thesk counter, stenchitrizers, ketchup, yogurt, whiskey, powerboats, dishobound, dishutrist, YI 990, 990 and Athis. The federal government, $2 billion in support for affected workers and firms across the steel, aluminum, and manufacturing base, cushioning the immediate blow. Through the next year, the tariffs functioned like sand in finely machined gears. Metal costs spiked. Just in time, factories rewrote spreadsheets and hedged contracts, and exporters faced sudden uncertainty about whether their next shipment would clear at the same price as the last. Yet, the sky didn't fall all at once. Canada's economy is diverse, and the weight of steel and aluminum vital in the communities that make them remain small at the national level. Analysts who looked back at the first round 2018-2019 episode found the macro hit was measurable, but modest, with local pain in metals, towns, and pockets of adaptation elsewhere. The C.D. Howe Institute estimated a small decline in Canadian real GDP, while Statistics Canada's trade snapshots captured how some import and export flows pivoted, sometimes in counterintuitive ways. Diplomacy eventually removed the first roadblock. In May 2019, Washington and Ottawa issued a joint statement lifting the Section 232 tariffs and the Canadian countermeasures with a monitoring mechanism and the threat that duties could snap back if import surges reappeared. The relief was palpable. Supply contracts normalized and USMCA ratification proceeded without the metal cloud. The truce didn't end the story, but it showed that retaliation had leverage and that the two countries could de-escalate when politics allowed. The détente proved fragile. In August 2020, the United States reimposed a 10% tariff on certain Canadian aluminum, alleging a surge. $29.8 billion basket of U.S. goods, C2, $6 billion in steel, C2, $6 billion in steel, C3 billion in aluminum, and $14.2 billion in other targeted products ranging from hardware to electronics and cast iron items. The list was methodically constructed to balance pressure and self-harm, leaning on inputs with domestic alternatives and on consumer goods where substitution would be politically durable. As talks sputtered, Canada signaled it would keep countermeasures in place and adjust them as needed, an approach that a string of legal memos from major firms and policy shops quickly passed for clients on both sides of the border. What does all of that mean on the ground in Canada? Start with the map. Quebec's Saguenay region is the beating heart of North American primary aluminum. British Columbia hosts Kitimat and Ontario's Golden Horseshoe houses, steel-making towns, and metal fabricators clustered around auto plants. In 2018 to 2019, those hubs experienced the direct effects first, and the same pattern is repeating in 2025. Only more intensely because the tariff rates are higher and broader. For smelters that sell into us, can sheet, aerospace, and automotive markets. A 50% border tax doesn't just hurt margins, it tests the viability of cross-border contracts. For steel mills feeding NAFTA-era platforms in Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio, the math of sourcing and logistics changes overnight. Yet, the story is more nuanced than tariffs. Bad Canada suffers. Not least because North America's supply chains are welded together. US manufacturers are also major buyers of Canadian metal. And when their costs jump, orders can fall or shift, ricocheting back into Canadian employment and investment decisions. That dynamic is precisely why irate US manufacturers pressed the Trump administration to lift metals tariffs in 2019, and why again in 2025, American business associations and labor business coalitions have warned about damage from higher input prices. Ottawa's strategy, hit back in ways that mobilize counterpart pressure in Congress and US state houses, leans on that integrated reality. Zoom out to the macro lens and to truths coexist. First, metals are critical to specific communities and sectors, but they account for a small share of Canada's total economy. The Business Data Lab synthesizing US Trade Commission findings and Canadian data pegs steel and aluminum exports at roughly 1% of Canada's GDP. While noting Canada is uniquely exposed as the top US supplier in both categories. About half of US primary aluminum imports and roughly a quarter of steel imports come from Canada. Second, even small shares can cause outsized turbulence when they sit at the base of sprawling value chains like autos, construction, packaging, and machinery. That's why economists say the overall GDP hit is modest while acknowledging that layoffs, idled capacity, and investment delays can bite hard in the places where mills and smelters anchor local life. The 2018 episode left a complicated statistical footprint. Counterintuitively, some import and export flows rose in the near term as firms raced to adjust, and employment in Canadian steel and aluminum product industries actually increased in 2018 and 2019, helped by firm-specific investments, a weaker Canadian dollar at times, and substitution that favored regional suppliers. But the longer-run academic and central bank work points to a familiar pattern. Tariffs raise input costs, crimp downstream manufacturing, and slow job growth outside the protected pocket. The Federal Reserve found US manufacturing employment fell relative to trend after 2018, and Canadian analysts saw a mix of resilience and rerouting, alongside clear evidence of price pass-through on tariff goods. Those stylized facts are the cautionary backdrop to 2025's sharper escalation. There is also the politics byproduct dimension. The catch-up wars and bourbon diplomacy that marked 2018. Canada's first retaliation list was calibrated to send messages. Swing state distilleries, iconic household brands, and leisure goods with lobbying clout. The aim wasn't to make Canadians suffer. It was to make the right Americans call their representatives. The 2025 list reprises that playbook at a larger scale, adding categories that reflect post-pandemic consumption and tech, hardware. Legal notices in the Canada Gazette and Department of Finance postings make clear the logic. Match duties dollar for dollar and keep the list adjustable as negotiations ebb and flow. In practice, that means some Canadian retailers pay more to import US-made goods, and some consumers see higher prices or switch to alternatives. But it also means Ottawa has credible bargaining chips when the two sides return to the table. No conversation about Trump-era tariffs in Canada is complete without two detours. The first is softwood lumber, a dispute that predates Trump and will likely outlive every current political actor. In 2017 to 2018, as metals battles heated up, the US International Trade Commission and Commerce Department also moved ahead with ADD-CVD orders on Canadian softwood lumber, reimposing a familiar cycle of reviews and rate changes. Softwood isn't technically a Section 232 tariff story, but to a Canadian sawmill in BC or New Brunswick, it felt like part of the same protectionist weather system. The duties raised costs for US home builders and ultimately American home buyers, while constraining Canadian producers. One more example of how border frictions punch both ways. The second detour is newsprint. In 2018, US authorities slapped tariffs on Canadian uncoated groundwood paper, only for the US International Trade Commission to overturn them that summer after an outcry from American newspapers already under digital pressure. The reversal was a reminder that not every trade action survives contact with economic reality or legal scrutiny, and that Canada's best defense has often been a methodical case marshaled through institutions, not just counter-tariffs. Autos have always been the doomsday scenario hovering over every tariff announcement. In 2018, the US opened a national security investigation into vehicles and parts, brandishing the threat of sweeping car tariffs as leverage during USMCA talks. Those tariffs were never imposed in the first term, but side letters and quota-like assurances were negotiated precisely because the integrated auto platform across Ontario. Meanwhile, central bankers and bank economists watch the pass-through. The Bank of Canada's staff, work and private sector rules of thumb emphasize that broad tariff shocks are inflationary for the targeted goods and can trigger second-round effects. That in turn affects interest rate paths, the currency and financing costs for Canadian firms. It's important not to overstate what tariffs alone can do. Canada's metals ecosystems are not passive. Companies invest in productivity, switch to higher value grades, and seek new buyers in Europe and Asia. Governments can and do deploy adjustment tools, work-sharing programs, training supports, financing. And because the tariff burden ultimately lands on US buyers, too, the politics are never one-sided. That is why 2019 ended with tariffs lifted, and why even in 2025, the Canadian strategy again combines reciprocity, litigation options under and charisma and the patient work of building coalitions with US customers who don't want to pay 50% more for the metal that goes into their products. Ottawa's public statements this year have been explicit about both the economic harm to US manufacturers and the pathways for dispute settlement if negotiations fail. One more nuance. For all the drama, Canada's metals footprint in US supply chains is valuable precisely because it is reliable, low carbon, notably in aluminum, smelted with hydropower, and close. Tariffs don't change that underlying advantage, they tax around it. The Business Data Lab's work highlights how Canada's share of US aluminum imports has remained dominant and how North America's comparative advantage in integrated, rules-based production can't be replicated overnight by distant suppliers. That's why when tariffs are lifted, orders bounce back quickly. It's also why, when tariffs stay high, the damage compounds not just for Canadian towns, but for American manufacturers and their workers. So, how have Trump's tariffs affected Canada? In three concentric circles. In the inner circle, the metals, towns, the tariffs have been a direct tax on livelihoods negotiated day by day in purchase orders and shift schedules. The pain is real, but so is the agency. Firms retool, unions lobby, and communities draw on a long history of riding commodity cycles and trade squalls. In the middle circle, the manufacturing belts from Windsor to Winnipeg, the tariffs have been a chronic source of uncertainty, a reason to delay a capital project or diversify a supplier list, an irritant that sneaks into prices for cars, appliances, and construction materials. And in the outer circle, the macroeconomy, tariffs have been a modest drag, an inflationary nudge, and a political pressure point that forces policymakers to juggle support for affected sectors with the need to keep the broader economy moving. None of those circles exists in isolation. They spin together. The circle is diplomatic. The 2018 to 2019 episode demonstrated that measured retaliation and legal process could unwind at bad equilibrium. The 2020 snapback proved that vigilance matters. The 2025 escalation with higher rates and a wider scope has again tested the system. Canada's response has been to keep faith with the tools that worked before. Reciprocal tariffs carefully targeted to minimize self-harm, support for workers and firms, and a readiness to use dispute mechanisms if talks fail, while reminding US partners that these are not abstract games. They are the prices on a pallet of coils, the wages on a payday in the Saguenay, and the delivery time on a component that crosses the border 5 times before the car starts. As long as tariffs are the instrument of choice in Washington, Canada will absorb some pain, but it will also push back, adapt, and keep making the case to Americans as much as to Canadians that the surest path to competitive, secure North American manufacturing is the one that removes the tax from the metal in the first place. Key sources for dates, rates, and policy actions referenced above. U.S. Section 232 announcements and reversals. 2018 imposition, 2019 lifting, 2020 snapback and withdrawal. Canada's 2018 and 2025 retaliation, lists and support measures. And 2025 tariff escalations for economic context. See the Business Data Lab. Synthesis of metals, trade exposure. Central bank and bank economist analysis of pass-through and macro impact. And legal analysis of the June 2025 moves. Canada's experience under Trump's trade wars is best understood not only through the direct clash over metals, but also by tracing the ripples outward, through industries tied by supply chains, through the rhythms of provincial economies, and through the long-term recalibration of Canadian trade diplomacy. Tariffs are rarely static. They evolve, compound, and trigger countermeasures. Their impact accumulates in ways that reshape not just quarterly GDP numbers, but also corporate strategies, political alliances, and even consumer habits. To see how Trump's tariffs have affected Canada, one must follow the strands that extend far beyond steel and aluminum. Nowhere were the anxieties sharper than in the automotive sector. Vehicles and auto parts represent Canada's largest export to the United States, and assembly plants in Ontario are deeply enmeshed in just-in-time systems that depend on the seamless movement of components across the border. Even when autos themselves were not directly targeted, the tariffs on steel and aluminum reverberated through the cost structure of every vehicle produced. Automakers in Canada faced higher input costs while their US counterparts, often using Canadian steel in Detroit or Ohio plants, absorbed similar shocks. That shared vulnerability became a paradox. Canadian plants suffered, but so too did the US manufacturers that depended on them. The threat of auto tariffs during the NAFTA renegotiation served as a sword of Damocles, forcing Canadian negotiators into late-night sessions that shaped the final contours of the USMCA, CUSMA in Canada. Even after the immediate threat passed, firms grew wary of the unpredictability. Several automakers delayed new investments or opted to allocate future capacity to plants in Mexico or the United States, calculating that Ottawa's leverage in Washington was limited and that protectionist currents might return. This chilling effect on investment outlasted the tariffs themselves, a reminder that the economic cost of uncertainty can exceed the direct cost of duties. Tariffs spilled into agriculture in complex ways. The United States did not broadly target Canadian farm exports with metals tariffs, but Canada's retaliation lists deliberately hit American agricultural goods. Whiskey from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, and yogurt from Wisconsin found themselves on Ottawa's tariff rosters. For Canadian consumers, this meant price shifts and new sourcing opportunities. Mexican orange juice, European whiskey brands, Canadian dairy processors stepping in where US imports grew more expensive. At the same time, Canadian farmers felt squeezed indirectly. Rising metal costs raised the price of farm equipment, storage, silos, and machinery. Tractors, combines, and even fencing materials all rely on steel and aluminum. That inflationary ripple meant farmers faced tighter margins even if their own exports were not tariffed. Moreover, retaliatory measures risked souring cross-border agricultural integration. The cattle and pork industries, for example, move animals and meat across the border in both directions depending on processing capacity. Even the possibility of expanded tariffs forced producers to diversify markets more aggressively, turning eyes to Asia and Europe in anticipation of turbulence in the US relationship. The geography of the tariffs' impact was uneven. Quebec bore the brunt in aluminum with its hydropowered smelters facing an existential question. Could they remain competitive if the United States, their largest customer, permanently taxed their exports at 25 or 50%? For a province where aluminum has been a symbol of industrial identity since the early 20th century, the threat was cultural as well as economic. Ontario felt the hit in steel and autos as Hamilton's mills and Oshawa's assembly plants found themselves at the intersection of costlier inputs and fragile demand. British Columbia's lumber and forestry industries were squeezed by the parallel saga of softwood lumber duties which coincided with the metals battle. The prairie provinces, though less directly exposed in metals, experienced the secondary costs of more expensive equipment and higher shipping rates, as well as the broader uncertainty that rattled investment in energy and infrastructure projects. Atlantic Canada experienced subtler effects. Ports like Halifax and St. John, long reliant on cross-border shipping, saw logistical disruptions as tariffs shifted trade flows. Nova Scotia's steel plant in Sydney and Newfoundland's offshore energy projects both required imported steel, making them sensitive to global price changes triggered by the trade war. While not the epicenter, the region was still caught in the web. For ordinary Canadians, tariffs translated into price tags. Aluminum cans for beer and soda grew costlier. Automobiles saw incremental price hikes as metals costs passed through supply chains. Appliances already sensitive to global steel markets became more expensive. Even if some price shifts were small, the psychological effect was clear. Tariffs were no longer an abstract debate among diplomats, but a reality visible in grocery aisles and dealership showrooms. The Bank of Canada took notice. Economists monitored how tariff-induced inflation might complicate monetary policy. While Canada's overall inflation remained within target for much of the late 2010s, the central bank's commentary often highlighted trade uncertainty as a key downside risk. When inflationary pressures re-emerged in 2025 under new, higher tariffs, the concern was sharper. Persistent tariffs at 50% rates on base metals risk feeding into second-round price increases, especially if businesses use the turmoil to justify broader hikes. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Trump's tariffs on Canada lies in corporate strategy. Firms that had once taken cross-border integration for granted began to hedge. Canadian manufacturers invested in building more domestic supply options, even if at higher cost, to reduce vulnerability to sudden tariff shocks. Companies with plants on both sides of the border reconsidered production allocation, sometimes duplicating facilities rather than relying on seamless supply. Some US buyers, reluctant to pay tariffs, sought alternative global suppliers. In aluminum, this meant more imports from the Middle East or Asia, despite longer shipping times and weaker environmental standards. For Canadian producers, the move forced a diversification strategy, cultivating European and Asian buyers, highlighting Canada's low carbon footprint and lobbying for recognition of green aluminum as a premium product. The same pattern played out in steel, where Canadian firms sought new niches in high-grade and specialty products less easily substituted. In the long run, tariffs may have spurred innovation, but they also imposed costly detours, redirecting capital and managerial attention from growth into crisis management. The tariffs strained what had long been one of the closest alliances in global trade. Canada and the United States are not just neighbors. They are treaty allies, NATO partners, and participants in a deeply integrated economic space. The use of national security as a justification for tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum struck many Canadians as insulting, implying that their industries posed a threat to the United States. Diplomatic channels buzzed with tension. Ottawa carefully avoided open confrontation, but made clear that Canada would not accept unilateral punishment without response. Retaliation lists were crafted with surgical precision to remind Washington of Canadian leverage while leaving space for eventual reconciliation. This balancing act, assertive yet measured, was a hallmark of Canada's approach. In the long run, the episode altered Canada's diplomatic posture. Ottawa doubled down on trade diversification, accelerating efforts to deepen ties with Europe through CETA and with Pacific partners through CPTPP. The logic was simple. If the United States could no longer be trusted as a stable anchor, Canada needed more ballast elsewhere. Tariffs, ironically, energized the diversification agenda in ways that polite policy papers never could. Canada also turned to legal avenues. The